It's also probably like your brain has learned certain pathways to avoid certain kinds of pain. And even when those pain points have gone away, your like pathway has been structured in just a way that you don't think, oh, I could be taking a shortcut here. Hi, I'm Divya,
Hi, I'm Karan.
and this is Thinking on Thinking. So, when I started thinking about pain, I was thinking about. So, do you know about the concept of like eustress and distress?
No?
Okay, so the parts of our brain that are sensitive to pain are also the parts which are close to making new memories. So, quite literally,
Oh,
we learn through pain.
interesting.
Now, in the current world, we just have one word that we use to denote pain, which is stress. But in psychology, I don't know where the origin is, but I'm quite sure that it would be somewhere in the Greek and Roman philosophers. They must have come up with this stuff. There's the concept of eustress, which is like good stress, and there's the concept of distress, which is basically like when you're overloading the system, it's distress. But eustress is required for the system to progress or move forward.
Interesting. What does it mean to move forward in that context?
So, like to learn anything new, for your brain to form any new circuits, right? So, like your brain will form new circuits in both cases. But let me put it like this: our brain would love to stay in a comfortable position if it can, forever. It's
Hmm.
lazy and evolutionarily adapted towards just staying wherever it is. But it's only through sort of some amount of introduced eustress that we can grow. Even as you were talking about, like, for example, you are seeing your nephew learning how to walk or learning how to operate in the world or doing things. He's definitely experiencing some amount of stress from not being able to do the thing.
That's interesting. Yeah. We were actually talking about something kind of similar to that, right? That like it's interesting how when he like falls down, he doesn't know that you're supposed to be sad.
Hmm.
Unless you react in a way that you're like, "Oh my god," right? Yeah, he doesn't know that that's the reaction. It was really interesting how we have formed these kind of understandings of like, oh, I have this sensation. This sensation means this. I should then react in this way. And how you kind of group different things together, right? Like it's something that actually comes up when I'm working out, like both when I was in India with my trainer there, and then also here, is like the difference between different things, right? Like, are you in pain? Are you sore? Are you like, right? And I think like it's very easy to kind of group that all together and be like, oh, this is, net unpleasant.
Yeah.
Do you feel like that culturally there is more of a distinction in some places? Or you feel like everyone has just kind of gone to this notion of like being under stress is painful. We don't want to be under stress. Or at least grouping all of that together.
I think that if you're in a underprivileged society or you belong to an underprivileged group, you're more, again, like I don't have data to back it up. I think that you'd be much more sensitive to pain and much more likely to group things under distress. So, like, for example, in
Interesting.
India, also, I feel this that people are a lot less adventurous in groups or, like, in areas where there is more, just overall, the level of distress in society is much higher. If the overall level of distress in society is higher, then people are way more likely to feel like any sign of distress is distress, or rather, they will try to
Interesting.
protect themselves rather than trying to grow from it. It's basically a little bit like, if you overload a system, the system will shut down.
Hmm.
So, in a weird way, people who are like, chronically under distress, they are very good at being bare level functioning, but they're not very like thrive. Again, there are like too many concepts getting mixed up, maybe, but there is like the difference between thriving and surviving. And there is even that thing about how your brain functions differently when you are in survival mode versus when you are in thriving mode, right? And I think that in survival mode, you're not trying to learn deep lessons about growth. You're just trying to learn lessons about what can harm me. And if you're primed towards that, you're much more likely, or at least that's what I'm hypothesizing, that if you're primed towards that, you would be much more likely to just break in your experience in that fashion.
Interesting. Yeah. Do you feel like understanding the distinction is an important part of being in a thrive state? Like understanding the distinction between different kinds of stress or different kinds of pain?
I think so. So this is interesting because I remember like when I had first started working out a few years back, I used to be like, wow, I am in pain all the time. How is this better? But over time, I realized, no, 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 this is definitely better. Like, and not just because it's long term, it's going to be better for me, but this is a very different kind of pain. I just didn't have that resolution initially.
Yeah. That's interesting. That reminds me, I trained with this guy in India, and he said it really interestingly because I have chronic pain in my hip, and he was kind of saying if we can recast it to be a signal versus to be something you're fighting against, then it can be helpful to just then it's a signal for you.
Yeah.
And then his kind of point was have a goal, right? Like have a goal that's not just being pain free, but have a different goal, and then you can use the pain as a signal against that goal. I think that it was very interesting, and it is kind of, and it, I mean, since then it just has generally gotten better and continued to get better. It's an interesting way of thinking about it.
This is very interesting because that's like overall, I don't know if this is newer, but I've heard this concept in a few different places that like think of your emotions as signals. And even for me, when I started thinking about that, discomfort just became, okay, something is wrong here.
Yeah.
Instead of it being like, everything's falling apart, we need to close this shop down, destroy everything, and run away.
I usually have a feeling that things are not going to work, like desperately not going to work right before they do work, which is kind of an interesting, like even as we were selecting this topic for a moment, I was like, oh my God, this is going to be very boring. We're not going to be able to figure out anything to talk about. How will we? And I was like, oh, maybe this is a good topic for us. That's interesting to understand, like, yeah, how do you react to certain things? And then how can you, which kind of brings me to the thing I was talking to you about last night, right? Which is like, how do you start to understand yourself and the way you react in different situations? And then how do you like now, for example, like I know that this about myself, right? That I will tend to kind of feel this fear of failure really intensely right before the start of something. Now, understanding when, because that as I am more cognizant of it, it's likely that will become less strong, right? Or it might become more accurate.
Yeah.
And then, like, making sure that your compensation has not led to you completely disregarding, or at least not interpreting in the best way possible, because your signaling may be coming from a different point, as your kind of the way you treat your inputs has shifted over time. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, but it makes me think of like Ford had this famous quote that if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse.
Yeah.
Right? So the general wisdom in design, especially in user experience communities, is that the user knows when there is a problem. They just don't know what the solution is. And I think that like that's similar to the emotion part of your brain. It's like very good at figuring out when there is a problem. Like the rational part of your brain is very good at rationalizing away problems. Right? Like the emotional part of you is a child. It's gonna throw a tantrum every single time. It's like, everything's wrong. Great, everything's great. It's perfect. And like the rational part of you is gonna try to tamper from both, like make it a little less intense from both sides. But I think that just understanding that when there is a signal, it needs to be processed through. At least like that is what I think I do, especially as somebody who is, I mean, I don't feel that many symptoms anymore, but like as someone who was bipolar, like had episodes quite frequently, it was very important to protect other people from my emotions that way. And it's like, I can laugh about it right now, but when you're in the middle of the thing, you have to really, really think about, okay, is this signal, like how much of it is noise, how much of it is false amplification?
And because a lot of times you also start to run into like remembered pain, you know, or just like carried baggage, which then can be difficult to parse as well, right? Like, because where are you reacting because you've put it into a box that you understand, right? Where you're like, oh, I know what this is, and sometimes it happens subconsciously, right? Where
Yeah.
you're like, oh, I know what this is. This is this, and then it's like, well, was it this, or did it just seem like it was this?
Yeah.
Gaurav, my husband was scolding me a little bit last night when we were at dinner, where he was like, I feel like I think he said you're very quick to conclude things about your mother's intentions, and I was like, that's interesting that you say that, because I think that's just something I do, right? Like you spend a lot of time with your close family members, right? And you're like, oh, you're saying this, I know why you're saying this, I know you, and then you immediately start playing the script in your head that may or may not be true.
Yeah.
Interesting.
It also stops, like, have you ever experienced this, that when you are around, let's say friends from school, you go back to a certain period of time, and when you are around
For
friends
sure.
from college, you go back to that period of time, right?
Oh, you mean in the way one acts, like
Yeah, or
themselves?
feels, like even your own feeling of yourself, like it changes when you are with your family, like it becomes slightly different. Like there is a period of your time where your brain just goes back to.
I wonder what's going to happen for me at my wedding. But I think you're exactly right. I was just thinking about it, right? Especially for me, because there's certain people, because I moved a lot, so I haven't like hung out as much with my high school friends since I was a teenager. And then there was like people that, yeah, just, I lived in New York in my early 20s, right? Like, so there's people I knew from that period, and you behaved in a certain way.
Yeah.
Um,
I always find it very interesting that your brain will try to sort of drag you back in that space. So it's not even like, while Gaurav is right that you just play the script for your mother, but honestly, like, you also play the script for yourself. Like, you also
yeah.
get, like, it's not just other people who get stuck in that script. You also get stuck in that script because she's going to say something, then you're going to behave the way that in your brain you have always behaved. You have assumed her intentions as well as your intentions, which is like both of them are untrue.
I do feel like it's easy, at least for me, that it can be very contextual,
Okay.
right? Like, I think we behave differently with each other at home, or particularly in like this house, than like when we are like traveling, or I don't know. I was just thinking about how like Gaurav and I moved back to Seattle in December, and I feel like I have made different routines than I used to have when I lived in Seattle, but I think it's because I live in a different place. So it was easier for me to not, whereas otherwise when I was working in India and I would travel back to Seattle, I would generally just follow the same routines that I've always had, right? Which is like, I would probably spend like 2 hours in my room or in my bed before I would get up in the morning, right? And I like did not exercise very much, and like I just had a certain kind of like lifestyle that was very similar to like the life I had when I was a teenager. And I think now not coming back to like my childhood bedroom and like being here, with my husband, or soon to be husband, will just be interesting. Yeah, I'm sorry. It is interesting. It's interesting because it's been so much easier to create different just ways of interacting with the world and ways of interacting with myself.
It's also probably like your brain has learned certain pathways to avoid certain kinds of pain. And even when those pain points have gone away, your like pathway has been structured in just a way that you don't think, oh, I could be taking a shortcut here.
Yeah. It's because I really don't like people asking me questions in the morning. For a while. And so I know when I was younger, right, like I would come down and then people had been awake for a while, so they would just be full of questions about like, what are you doing today, where are you going, like, and I was just like, that's very interesting. Yeah, I think that was hard for me. Like, even when I went back to swimming, it was hard because for so long, swimming had been something that I was like forced to do. And so it was hard for me to see or find the parts of it that I liked. Like, there was so much where I was like, like I just didn't, there was something where I'm like, I don't want to go to the pool.
Do you feel like psychological pain is different from emotional pain, is different from physical pain? How does it feel for you?
I think that one tends to manifest the other a lot of times.
Interesting. Say more.
Right. It's interesting. Part of what attracted me to doing yoga and like improving my flexibility is I felt like it would like that I would become more settled in my, I mean, obviously this is what yoga teachers always tell you, right? Like you're finding balance both for your body and your mind. And I think part of that is true, but I also think, I don't know, there's a certain branch of yoga that started by this woman named Anna Forrest, and it's called Forrest Yoga. And she really feels like, or there's other people who believe in this kind of like ideas around, but really feels that pain gets stored in the body, right? So that especially trauma will get stored in the body, and that as you are able to kind of like unlock these areas, like you may re-experience that trauma in some ways, right? And I think that is kind of what I was thinking about just there, right? That I do think that you have associations of pain, for lack of a better word, right? And I think that...
Have we talked about this book, The Body Keeps the Score?
You mentioned it when you were reading it, but we didn't. I don't think we talked about it too much.
So the author of this book was one of the key researchers around PTSD and complex PTSD. His research is literally around trauma and how it shows up in your body. And like, how can you...
Very interesting.
I mean, like, it's a very, very technical book in terms of just the intended audience is other psychologists and psychiatrists. It's not necessary, like a layperson can understand it, but it's not necessarily written for a layperson. So like people can get triggered by it also. There are incidences in the book which are like, okay, this is very heavy. But it was very interesting how they talked about like the things that worked. Sometimes they wouldn't even know why it worked or why it didn't work. Like, for example, they had this technique which was almost like a rapid eye movement technique. And when they were researching this, that time sleep researchers had not yet figured out too much about REM sleep. And like, so there is like an entire chapter in that book where they go more into depth about how they came around the fact that, oh, there's something to do with the rapid movement of your eyes that helps you process information. We don't know why it happens, but if you recall a traumatic memory and you like, it has to be a trained person who is conducting the session, but it can really help people move past their trauma. And it was just really interesting how people's autoimmune disorders change, or their like gut disorders change based on like how they process their trauma. So it was a very interesting read. Like when you were talking about, pain gets stored in your body. Again, there is no way to non-hokily say it in short form, but there is some like research happening in that direction. It's almost like, 5 years ago, we got to know that, the gut is connected to your brain, and if your gut is improved, your depression can go away. And it's like, this is 5 years ago research. We have been eating food since we have been like, since there has been life. I'm sure that there is like, a lot there.
Yeah, that is interesting. You reminded me while you were talking of this book I read a while ago called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. Have I ever told you about this? Mm-hmm. It's a book about addiction. Mm-hmm. It's very interesting. Again, it's kind of not so much written for the layperson, but it's very dense. But it's a psychiatrist who is working with patients who are living on the streets who have various addictions.
Wow.
And what he kind of explores is how people kind of substitute addictions. It's really interesting how it's not necessarily like even though we have a big focus on substance and substance dependency and helping people break substance dependency in overcoming their addiction, a lot of times that is not enough because there's some underlying reason that has led to them having an addiction, and that they can it's very easy for you to just substitute something else. And then socially, there's certain things that we feel like are acceptable addictions, right? People who work obsessively, people who exercise obsessively, we've decided that those are socially acceptable. Yeah. But, other ones are bad. You shouldn't drink too much coffee, or like you shouldn't, I don't know. I guess those ones also have substance dependencies. But, it's fitness also in a lot of ways is a substance dependency because you are creating material, you're creating a certain reaction in your body. Actually, my brother-in-law was talking a few days ago about how his grandmother, who lived to like be 94, never exercised a day in her life, right? Like she never went out for a run or something like that. She just did exercise through living, and she lived to be 94, right? Like this notion that kind of like, we have to go out and do 20 or 30 minutes of exercise every day is just an interesting notion. We're creating a pathway for people to do, I guess, to deal with their addictions, but necessarily I don't know. I guess to manage, I would say more than to actually like understand where it's this behavior coming from.
Do you know about the rat study on addiction?
No.
Okay, so I don't remember when it was, but there was a study done on rats. By the way, I'm quoting so many random neurological and psychological stuff as if I know too much about it. But so there was this study done on rats. So basically, they gave cocaine access to one group, and like basically they can press a button and they would be like, whatever would come out would have cocaine on it, and those rats OD'd. They just had too much cocaine. They would just like press the button, something would come out, they would eat it, they would press the button again, that would happen. And then there was a different cage where they could get access to cocaine or they could go and play with other rats. And those just went and played with other rats.
Interesting.
And like this was very preliminary study on basically we're making a personal problem out of something which is more systemic and social in nature. Like addiction is a remnant of your social circuitry is not satisfied. I mean, like this is oversimplification of the research, of course. There are multiple factors. They could be, this was a rat study, not necessarily a human study, but you can think about it also in other correlatory ways, like how in heterosexual relationships, when men lose their partner in later ages, their life expectancy reduces by a lot, while for women it slightly increases. And it's because like men generally, especially straight men, generally tend to have like their social net as their female partner. That's the only person who they have any emotional intimacy with, while for women they have a network in most cases.
Interesting. There's that funny thing about golf courses, right?
Uh-huh.
That like the world has to suffer through all of these millions of acres being devoted to golf just because men can't ask other men to go for a walk.
Oh man, that's dark.
Yeah.
Wow.
Very funny though.
Do you feel like it's true?
Oh yeah, like it's not socially, especially in like kind of, I don't know, Western influenced cultures. I can't remember, like it was a big thing when walking meetings were like in vogue like 10 years ago, because it was like, oh, we're gonna go for a walking meeting.
Oh wow. This is incredible, because now that you're making me think, when I was in college, I used to go on walks with my friends so often. But the guy friends would never go on walks with each other, per se. They, especially like like a walk meant you're hanging out one-on-one with your friend.
Yeah.
And like in a public, social, but personal situation. But like guys wouldn't do that with each other.
In India, it's like, I think it's a big smoking culture that people use for it, right? It's like, oh, let's go get like some cigarettes. And then like people will just, right, even if they don't smoke, they will just go for getting the cigarettes and then standing outside with people. It was very interesting when I started working in India, because I eventually like started socially smoking, because I was like, well, this is one way to like hang out with people. Luckily, I didn't continue smoking, but it was interesting.
I feel like we didn't close anything today, but all of these are like really interesting notions, right? Because there's also this aspect of social pain, which is like neither, like it is slightly emotional and it's slightly psychological, but it is something that I don't even know if we have the vocabulary for it as a culture.
Yeah, I don't know if I know exactly what you're thinking. What do you mean when you say that?
When people feel loneliness, they're missing like it's a signal for something is missing in your life. But we don't have enough definition on what is missing.
Interesting.
Right? Like sometimes people would be like, yeah, I have people in my life and I still feel lonely. And there are people who would absolutely enjoy solitude. The same person could feel lonely in a group of friends and they could be perfectly fine if they are alone. Like there are so many complex like emotional things around that. Because we started talking about addiction, and from there, my brain went into, oh, there's like this aspect of social pain.
But isn't that's like, at least in the three categories you were giving earlier, I feel like that's psychological pain, right? Psychological, emotional, physical.
I mean, of course, you could put into that, but I don't know if like that would capture all of the aspects of it, because there is this interpersonal or like, relational aspect to this.
It's really interesting. It's like wanting to fit in with the group. It's that drive that we have.
Yeah. Or with someone in particular. Like you must have done this also. Sometimes you meet a friend of yours and it's a very satisfying interaction. And sometimes you meet the same friend and it's a very dissatisfying interaction.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's so bad that it has eroded away some of the capital that you had built together.
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah. I don't know if I know exactly what that is. You're right. It is something. It's not. It is kind of a pain in itself, but it usually is something you don't really think about, and you're just like, oh, that was not the best, and then you change your behavior slightly because
Yeah.
you avoid it in the future.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Maybe we can discuss more about this next time, because I have like this, as you were saying, I got reminded of this like amazing episode from Radio Lab about how words help you think more.
Interesting.
But next time, we'll talk about that next time.
Fine. We'll discuss that next time.
Awesome. Good chat.
Good talk.
Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to this episode of Thinking on Thinking. Our theme music is by Steve Combs, and you can find a link to it in the show notes.